Hello, good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to this session in which we pay tribute to the memory of the great thinker and historian Gertrude Himmelfarb. I am honored to have been asked to host this session. Unlike the distinguished members of this panel, Dr. Plattner, Dr. Christel, and Professor Espada, I unfortunately never had the privilege of meeting Gertrude Himmelfarb personally. Nevertheless, I have come to know a bit about her ideas and concerns through some of her numerous books and essays. Himmelfarb wrote extensively throughout her long and productive life. I was first introduced to Gertrude Himmelfarb's ideas through her book Lord Acton, A Study in Conscience and Politics. The study is an intellectual biography which clearly presents the threads of Acton thought as a historian, a Catholic, and a classical liberal. For someone interested in the topic of freedom and religion, as is my case, this is a very important book that I revisit regularly. Himmelfarb had the unique ability to grasp the essential ideas of those she wrote about. As you may see in the following passage on Lord Acton thought, and I quote, "Power corrupted, conscience redeemed. History was a tug of war between the two, with tyranny and freedom as the stakes." With one last twist, Acton took the idea of conscience out of the reign of metaphysics and placed it within the province of politics. While conscience itself was the metaphysical warrant for liberty, the conflict of consciences was its empirical security. Our conscience exists and acts for ourselves. It exists in each of us. It is limited by the consciences of others. Therefore, it tends to restrict authority and to enlarge liberty. It is the law of self-government, unquote. Gertrude Himmelfarb also had a special aptitude for understanding and explaining the intellectual conflicts of the historical periods she reflected on, calling particular attention to the Victorian virtues she so admired, and I quote, "Hard work, sobriety, frugality, foresight. These were modest, mundane virtues, even lowly ones, but they were virtues within the capacity of everyone. They did not assume any special breeding or status or talent or valor or grace or even money. They were common virtues within the reach of common people," unquote. In these present times of moral relativism and disregard for history, traditions, and values, I am convinced we all have much to learn from Himmelfarb's works and the way in which she defended the ideas she believed in. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to our chair, Dr. Mark Plattner, who most of you know quite well. Dr. Plattner is founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and is now the journal's co-editor emeritus, as well as distinguished non-resident fellow at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy. He is now a member of NED's board of directors. Dr. Plattner is also the chairman of our Institute's International Advisory Board. Dr. Plattner, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rita, for those generous words. And thanks to Professor Espada and you and the whole team for bringing off this virtual conference. It's a real honor for me to have been asked to chair today's session. a tribute to the memory and the accomplishments of Gertrude Himmelfarb, the illustrious historian and essayist who died last year at the age of 97. I first met Gertrude Himmelfarb in 1971 when I began working as assistant editor of the Public Interest, a quarterly journal edited by our husband, Irving Crystal. So I knew her by her family name, B. Crystal, before I had a clear sense of the eminence of Gertrude Himmelfarb as a scholar. At that time, she was teaching in the City University of New York, where she'd earned her undergraduate degree before completing her doctoral studies at the University of Chicago. In 1978, she was named Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate School of the City University, where she continued to teach until after she and Irving moved to Washington in the mid-1980s. In looking back at her life and work, one cannot fail to be astonished at her extraordinary productivity. By my count, she wrote at least 16 books, ranging from lengthy historical works based on extensive and meticulous research to collections of essays addressing contemporary as well as historical subjects. Though for many years she had no university affiliation, she became the preeminent scholar of Victorian England of her generation. Her early works were on the lives and thought of the leading thinkers of that era. Book-length studies of Lord Acton, to which Rita has referred, of Charles Darwin and Darwinism, and of John Stuart Mill, along with a collection of essays published under the title Victorian Minds. This book, subtitled A Study of Intellectuals in Crisis and Ideologies in Transition, begins with essays on Edmund Burke, Jeremy Bentham, and Thomas Malthus, late 18th century thinkers whom Himmelfarb classified as proto-Victorians. Himmelfarb's next book, The Idea of Poverty, became the first in a 2-volume study of more than 1,000 pages that traced British thought and policy toward poverty from the time of Adam Smith and Malthus down through the 1880s. Remarkably, this monumental work of scholarship, its second volume would be entitled Poverty and Compassion, is also eminently readable thanks to the grace and lucidity of Himmelfarb's prose. She notes at the outset of the first volume that long dominant Christian conceptions had regarded poverty either as, quote, a blessing to be devoutly sought by those who embraced it as a sacred vow, close quote, or as an unhappy fact of life, quoting again, a cross to be borne with Christian fortitude or resisted with unchristian defiance. She then examines how growing secularism transformed this earlier outlook and how the Industrial Revolution led poverty to be viewed instead as a social problem to be solved. Tracing in detail the ways in which views of poverty evolved over a 100-year span, she draws upon a staggering variety of sources, including philosophers, economists, religious and political leaders, charitable organizations, radical newspapers, and works of fiction. In the latter category, she considers not merely famous authors like Disraeli and Dickens, but also largely forgotten writers whose novels were extremely popular in their day. I find The Idea of Poverty to be perhaps the most illuminating and impressive of all Himmelfarb's writings. I think we all of us on this panel have different favorite books of hers. But she went on to write many more notable books, increasingly addressing issues of contemporary culture and society, though usually in the light shed by comparison with the morals and manners of earlier times. Among these books were numerous collections of essays, Marriage and Morals Among the Victorians, The New History and the Old, On Looking into the Abyss, Untimely Thoughts on Culture and Society, the demoralization of society, from Victorian virtues to modern values, One Nation, Two Cultures, and The Moral Imagination from Edmund Burke to Lionel Trilling. The evocative titles of these collections convey a good sense of the ground that they cover and of her preoccupation with issues of morality and of culture. She also found time to complete another major work of intellectual history, The Roads to Modernity, the British, French, and American Enlightenments. This book, I believe, is a favorite of Professor Espada, and he might very well have assigned it to his students at the Institute. And finally, in the last decade of her life, Professor Himmelfarb published 2 books on British attitudes toward Jews and Judaism, and a final collection of essays entitled Past and Present, The Challenges of Modernity from the Pre-Victorians to the Postmodernists. Despite her unconventional academic career and her frequent critiques of contemporary attitudes and approaches, she received a number of high honors and distinguished awards. She was a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Historical Society, as well as of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Society of American Historians. She was a member of the Council of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center. In 1991, she was invited by the National Endowment for the Humanities to deliver its annual Jefferson Lecture. And in 2004, she was presented with the Humanities Medal by the President of the United States. She garnered all these achievements despite having begun her career in an era when it was still difficult for women to rise to the top of the academic profession. Moreover, she somehow was able to write all those books while enjoying a long and happy marriage and raising 2 wonderful children, her daughter Liz Nelson and her son Bill Crystal, who's with us here today. I want to just conclude these remarks by emphasizing what a lovely person Bea was. I never encountered anyone who didn't like Bea or had a harsh word to say about her. It's true that I didn't hang out with postmodern historians, who I'm sure had no use for her. But I did know people who had parted ways from Bea and Irving in the internecine warfare among the New York intellectuals, and yet retained a personal fondness for them. For like Irving, Bea could be a fierce polemicist in her writings, but she was unfailingly courteous in her personal relations. She had a spine of steel, but she was nonetheless a gentle soul, and the world is poorer in her absence. I'll now give the floor to our panelists, who both are longtime friends of mine. Our principal speaker is Bill Crystal, the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, which until its recent demise was America's leading conservative publication. Bill had the great good fortune of being born into the Crystal family, but he's carved out an impressive career of his own and is probably better known to the American public than was either of his parents. But first, we'll hear a briefer presentation by Professor João Carlos Espada, our virtual host and the mastermind of the Estoril Political Forum, who obviously is well known to you all and needs no further introduction. João?
Thank you. Thank you, dear Mark. Thank you, dear Rita, for your very kind and touching words. And thank you very much, Bill, for joining us. I'm very honored to be part of this session, paying tribute to the memory and the legacy of Gertrude Himmelfarb. And I would like to start by saying that Gertrude Himmelfarb, together with Irving Crystal, Raymond Plant, Ralph Dahrendorf, and Karl Popper, have been the 5 persons who have most vividly marked my intellectual adult life and who have strongly helped me with no material interests whatsoever. All of them I have known first through their books. Only after that have I had the privilege of knowing them personally. In the case of Gertrude Himmelfarb, it was Karl Popper who first told me about her. It was through Popper too, that incidentally, that I had discovered Ralph Dahrendorf. Now the story goes like this. In the now distant years of 1990 to 1994, when I was doing my DPhil at Oxford under the supervision of Dahrendorf, with regular visits to Popper at his home in Kenley, south of London. During that period, Karl Popper told me that I should read a book by a certain Gertrude Himmelfarb on Lord Acton. That was the book that was also referred to by Rita. So Lord Acton, as Rita mentioned, was a 19th century classical liberal Catholic of whom I had never heard. I then went to my college library, but the book was not there. As an alternative, I found another book by Gertrude Himmelfarb, that was also quoted both by Rita and Mark. And the book was Victorian Minds, a study of intellectuals in crisis and ideologies in transition. The original edition was from 1952, I believe. I read the book in one stroke. And next day, I decided to go to Blackwell's bookstore, where I ordered all the books by Himmelfarb. And the books started gradually coming in, and I read them all with immense delight. I then went to America in 1994-1996, where I taught at Brown and later Stanford universities. It was from there that I started writing letters insistently to Gertrude Himmelfarb, and only later did I discover that she was married to the famous founding father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, who founded and edited the excellent journal, The Public Interest, that Mark was the first, I think, assistant editor, and he also mentioned that. And by the way, Dahrendorf had the full collection of The Public Interest at his office at Oxford, and he very kindly gave to me the collection, which I have in my office here, over there. Okay, so in those insistent letters to Gertrude Himmelfarb, I insistently begged that we met. Finally, Gertrude Himmelfarb and Irving Kristol arranged a dinner with me in Washington, D.C., and I believe it must have been on 2 May 1996, because this is the date of B's kind inscription on my edition of Victorian Minds, which I made a point of taking with me to the dinner. It was an unforgettable dinner, but I only vividly remember, I mainly vividly remember two things. First, that I very unusually did not touch the wine throughout the whole dinner. And it was a long dinner. Second, that after a long conversation in which I spoke too much, I'm afraid, and too nervously, they asked me, quote, "How would you define yourself in political terms?" I thought I was going to faint. I only recall that after a long silence, I must have said something like, "I don't know, perhaps a Victorian liberal?" And I believe I recall a sweet and large smile from them, almost paternal. After this dinner, B and Irving started inviting me to several conversations with several of their friends in DC. It was through them that I met their son, William Kristol, Bill Kristol, who became and remained a very good friend of ours since then, and I'm delighted that he is with us at this session today. And later also I was introduced to Michael Novak, George F. Will, Christopher Demuth, Charles Krauthammer, Walter Burns, and many others. And it was after that first dinner in DC that Gertrude Himmelfarb accepted the invitation to give a lecture in Lisbon within the lecture series, The Democratic Invention, that I was coordinating at the kind invitation of former President Mário Soares, the founding father of the Portuguese democracy in 1974-75. And this series of lectures was the launching event of his recently created presidential foundation. It was a memorable evening at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation on 23 May 1997. Gertrude Himmelfarb was eloquently introduced by the Portuguese distinguished historian Maria Filomena Mónica. After this introduction, B gave a powerful lecture on democracy and modern values. She criticized Marxism and especially postmodern relativism, recalling that Nietzschean nihilism, together with materialistic Marxist relativism, had been associated with the intellectual atmosphere that had undermined Western democracy in the 1930s. And she concluded, recalling the role that the Victorian sense of duty and the Judeo-Christian religious tradition have played in sustaining the standards of decency and pluralism in those English-speaking democracies that had been able to resist alone against the communist and fascist avalanche in the 1930s. The speech was listened to in total silence. At the end, though, a flow of hostile questions took over the stage. I remember one very young girl taking the floor and saying that she had never heard such a reactionary speech since the times of Salazar. And Salazar was the Portuguese dictator from 1932 to 1968, whose times this girl obviously could not have known. But anyway, Gertrude Himmelfarb was absolutely surprised. She kindly responded to each and every criticism, recalling that she was defending the English-speaking democracies that alone had resisted against the Nazi communist coalition. The next day, over lunch at the York House in Lisbon, Bea kindly told me that she was sorry that she could have had created some embarrassment to me, but especially to former President Mário Soares, who was a democratic socialist. But she also made clear that she was very surprised by the radicalism of the reaction to her presentation, a reaction that strongly expressed the classical Francophone misleading identification of conservative liberalism with reactionary anti-liberalism. Following Bea's conference, I then went to speak to former President Mário Soares, and submitted my resignation, stating that I did not want to make him uncomfortable in a lecture series that marked the launch of his own foundation, personal foundation. Soares reacted with his classical composure and told me something along these lines that I quote from memory. Well, that Professor Himmelfarb is more conservative, maybe he said much more conservative than I am, is something that is beyond doubt. But the last thing that could happen is that I would now restore the Salazarist or communist censorships against which I have fought all my life. Do continue, therefore, with this pluralist program, which has been of the highest quality, end quote. Okay, I'm now delighted to recall that the same lecture series was later repeated in Washington, D.C. by the National Endowment for Democracy, by the kind initiative from the American Senate. Mário Soares was, in his own manner, and even though he did not like to admit it, an admirer of the great democracies of the English-speaking peoples that had resisted alone against the Nazi communist barbarianism. Gertrude Himmelfarb was above all a distinguished historian of Victorian Britain and of the subtle combination between liberty and a sense of duty that has underpinned the so-called English mystery. As she wrote in Victorian Minds, and I quote, "The true miracle of modern England," quoting Elie Alevi's famous expression, "the true miracle of modern England is not that she has been spared revolution, but that she has assimilated so many revolutions, industrial, economic, social, political, cultural, without recourse to revolution, with capital R," unquote. This was possible because the political culture of the English-speaking peoples had learned to avoid what Ralph Dahrendorf used to describe as unfortunate dichotomies between past and future, tradition and change, faith and reason, patriotism and cosmopolitanism. Gertrude Himmelfarb has put this art of avoiding unfortunate dichotomies at the very heart of the British and American Enlightenments, by contrast with the French and Continental Enlightenments. And I quote, "The British and American Enlightenments were," I quote from Himmelfarb, "the British and American Enlightenments were latitudinarian, compatible with a large spectrum of belief and disbelief. There was no Kulturkampf in those countries to distract and divide the populace, pitting the past against the present, confronting Enlightenment sentiment with retrograde institutions, and creating an unabridgeable divide between reason and religion. And for both British and American Enlightenments, religion was an ally, not an enemy," end quote. This is just a brief quote from one of Himmelfarb's books that I have found most crucial to, if I'm allowed to say, the enlightenment of the political culture of the European continent. And the book is called The Roads to Modernity, the British, French, and American Enlightenments, which was published in 2004. I vividly remember having attended the book launch at the British Academy in London. And I'm delighted that we have published a Portuguese edition of this book, even though it was published only in 2015. And as Mark Plattner has kindly just conjectured, the book has indeed ever been in the reading list of my course on the tradition of liberty. Now, please allow me to conclude by recalling a personal conversation with Karl Popper in Lisbon back in 1987, when he told me that I should, in fact, I believe he said, "You must do my doctorate in England." I then had a relatively comfortable position in Lisbon as political advisor to President Mário Soares and was a junior fellow at University of Lisbon. I was very surprised and asked Karl Popper, why should I go to Britain? Couldn't I study the British authors staying in Portugal? That would be more comfortable. And Popper then told me in a very intensive Popperian manner, he was very intense, and he said something like, quote, "There is a British mystery, a mystery of the English-speaking peoples, as Churchill called it, of uncompromising attachment to orderly liberty. You cannot really understand that mystery just by reading books. You must experience at least a bit of the daily life of the English-speaking countries, especially Britain, but also America." And Popper then talked about the mystery of the spirit of gentlemanship, which he thought was at the core of the political culture of the English-speaking peoples, the political culture that had hosted him as an exile, first in New Zealand, later in Britain, and that he admired so intensively. By the spirit of gentlemanship, Popper meant the attitude of someone, quote, "who does not take himself or herself too seriously, but who is prepared to take his or her duties very seriously, especially when most people around them talk only about their rights," end quote. It was on this mystery of the political culture of the English-speaking peoples, their association of liberty with a sense of duty, that the distinguished historian Gertrude Himmelfarb has given us an unforgettable work. I am tremendously grateful to her work and to the rare privilege of having known her personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao, for
It
those.
was not too long.
It's fine. Thank you, and very eloquent. And now we get to hear from Bill Crystal. Bill?
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be back at the Estoril Political Forum. I wish, and my wife Susan and I both wish, that we could be in Estoril, however, and back with so many friends and so many interesting people in such lovely setting. But I suppose in the spirit of the Victorians, we should all not complain and keep a stiff upper lip and pretend that this is just as good on Zoom. And it has its virtues, of course. But it's great to be I want to thank Rita and Joao for putting together this panel and Mark for chairing it. And it's great to be on a panel with old friends. I'd say Mark and Joao were two of my mother's favorite people from the younger generation. When you're 97, people our age are young, so that's good, you know. And I would say with Rita, honestly, I was thinking about this as you said, you'd never actually met my mother. One of the things she was always most pleased about was when she spoke on college campuses or at other places, to meet younger people, not students so much, but maybe younger professors whom she hadn't met and weren't at all contemporaries of hers, of course, but who had been influenced by her writing. I think that meant something a little special to her, really. And if people, 30, 50 years younger, 60, 70 years younger, found important guidance, introduction to other thinkers and guidance from her own thought in her writings. So she'd be very pleased by what you said as well. When we came back last year in 2019 from Estoril, from the conference, I remember vividly Susan and I having lunch with my mother and telling her about the conference. And she, of course, asked how various friends were, Joao and Mark and others, and she enjoyed hearing about it. She remembered, I think, the controversial talk she gave and almost a quarter century ago, but and it didn't leave any lasting scars on her. So she recovered from that pretty easily. I thought maybe it would be helpful today for me to talk a little bit about what you, very little bit actually, about, let's say, the other Gertrude Himmelfarb in this sense, she wrote a famous essay, became a book actually on John Stuart Mill, in which she emphasized the other Mill, the less dogmatically liberal Mill. I was thinking about that when I read the obituaries of my mother, many of which were very kind, and several of which described her one way or the other as a conservative defender of Victorian morality. That was kind of a standard line that was used. And it's mostly correct. I don't think she would have objected to any of those terms. She was mostly on the conservative side in her adult or later adult life, certainly, and friendly to the Victorians, and who would object to being a defender of morality, I guess. So she would be fine with that term. But I think she also would have wanted to qualify each of those. So maybe I will sort of take the other side and qualify each of those three terms of praise, which I do want to emphasize she would have understood as mostly as praise. Victorian morality. I think a couple of you have mentioned already her book, Victorian Minds, from the late 1960s, collection of essays. That book explicitly, the point of the title, and I'll just read a bit of it, is to say that there was no one Victorian mind. The point of the book, in some sense, was to fight against a slightly cartoonish version of the Victorians that prevailed, I think, very much at the time. I think by now it's receded some, maybe because of my mother's work and others, that the Victorians were all these, strict, stern, prim, proper moralists who didn't even understand whole aspects of life that was beyond the confines of the British, gentleman's house or British parliamentary politics, and that they were had rather limited, therefore, applicability. There was little one could learn from them. One could look back at them and think that was fun to, watch movies and, masterpiece theater, productions and so forth. And there were some interesting people, novelists maybe one could read from a different era, but nothing really to learn and nothing challenging. She very much rebelled against that. She wanted to emphasize the plurality of Victorian minds. Here's what she says in the introduction. The plurality of the title is deliberate. The Victorian mind would have been more euphonious but less accurate a title. She then says there is, she thinks, a Victorian ethos. That's a reasonable thing to talk about, but only if one appreciates its evolving character, if one makes allowances for the fact that it managed at different times and at different degrees to absorb quite distinct and even contrary ideas, ideologies, sentiments, and policies. The Victorian age exhibited not at its periphery, but at its center, all the diversity and much of the perversity of which the human mind is capable. It was an age of unbelief, but it was also an age of belief. And belief and unbelief were intimately and ingeniously related. It was an age of severe manners and morals, but of considerable latitude in behavior. It's been described by one historian as an age of equipoise, by another as an age of reform, by another as an age of revolution. So she says this book could have been called Varieties of Victorianism. So I think it's not just as a matter of historical scholarship that she thought it important to break open the Victorians and look at them in their complexity, individual thinkers in each of their own complexities, but also the complexities among thinkers, the diversity, which is really remarkable when you think about it, or when you look at the essays in Victorian Minds or in some of my mother's other books. These thinkers from one age had very, very different views of the world, of many fundamental issues of politics and society and morality. But I think also this was important because she thought one could really learn from the Victorians. They weren't simply a relic of another era. They weren't a kind of, as I say, a cartoon to look back at, either with disdain or even admiringly, as some did in the mid-20th century. But they dealt with these complexities. They dealt with these challenges. They dealt with these contrasting poles and had thought a lot about them. They were self-conscious and self-reflexive. I think that really comes out in so many of my mother's essays. These were real thinkers. They were real minds. They weren't just products of an age. And therefore, we can learn from them because we're still dealing with many of the same tensions and complexities. The Lord Acton book, which Rita mentioned in particular, and I don't know that book as well as some of the others, and I don't know the history of of historiography about Lord Acton. My impression is that Acton was almost entirely neglected when she chose that as her dissertation topic in the mid 40s and wrote that book. He was regarded as kind of an odd, kind of cranky person who was at once Catholic and serious about religion and also liberal in his politics and economics, and this extremely learned historian, but who was a great defender of liberty. But she, I think, found, I mean, I think it's no accident in a way that was her first, the paradoxical Acton, in a sense, was the first subject of her investigations. And again, that she wanted to learn from these thinkers, not simply look back at them either with disdain or admiration, for that matter. So the Victorian minds, not just one Victorian ethos. Secondly, she was a defender of morality, as I say. Who's going to deny that? And she was, in a genuine way, certainly against a kind of postmodern nihilism and relativism. But she wasn't a moralist, and she wasn't really a defender of moralism, I would say. In fact, the term she used most, perhaps in connection with morality, was the moral imagination. The book she wrote, pulled together in 2006, slightly revised as a second edition, I think in 2014 or something, but it isn't changed much. So that's a collection of essays that she put a lot of work into. I mean, she revised almost all the essays. And I remember she was challenged, well, you need to leave those essays alone so they stand as, what you said. And she said, and she quotes another historian to this effect too, look, I'm a historian. If I've improved my thinking, rethought something, I should capture that in my work. It's much more important to capture that than to have the kind of official historiography of the works of Gertrude Himmelfarb. So she rewrote, these are almost all based on earlier essays, the essays in the moral imagination, but they're all rewritten, and in some cases quite considerably, or in a couple of cases, Burke and Mill, she combines earlier essays and turns them into a whole. I would say from my point of view, this book is maybe the best introduction to her work that's not for specialists, and and if you want essays as opposed to perhaps a whole study, very easy, short, reasonably short essays, easy to read. You don't have to be an expert in any of these thinkers, but really, I think, wonderful essays, and on a range of thinkers: Jane Austen and George Eliot, Edmund Burke and John Stuart Mill, Disraeli and Churchill. So literary people, political thinkers. Dickens and Trilling, as she mentions as well, Idle Trilling. So I think that's a particularly useful book, The Moral Imagination, easy to get in paperback. But she loved the term, the moral imagination. She says in the preface, in the introduction to the book, that the term comes from Burke, and I think she first encountered it in Burke, but maybe made much more famous by Lionel Trilling, the great literary critic who was a good friend of my parents and very much admired by both of them, actually, and who died back in 1975, I believe. Moral imagination, my mother says, could have been the subtitle of all of these essays. The phrase does appear in the body of several of them. So this was important to her. And I think the thing to say is that both terms were important, moral and imagination. That morality is not simply a matter of doctrine or of obeying certain commands, and that can be important, obviously, at times, but really thinking through in an imaginative way what is right and what is possible is important as well, and that requires thinking the kind of a literary gift, you might say, as well as a political and philosophical disposition. My mother says in this introduction to the moral imagination, describing Walter Bagehot, she says, I spoke of the subtleties, complications, and ambiguities that he saw everywhere. And I would say generally, when you read these essays, and when you read my mother's work in general, one is struck by the subtleties, complications, and ambiguities of all these thinkers, real subtleties, real ambiguities, real complexities that they grappled with. My mother wasn't one of those who went in for complexity's sake, or irony for irony's sake, and would never resolve an issue. Quite the contrary, she was quite forceful often in her judgments on these thinkers, actually, and certainly on other matters. But I think she was forceful without being unjust to the ironies and complexities of these thinkers. One essay that she had, one thinker who had a pretty big impact on her, I think, later in life, whom she wrote about, and who's not in the Moral Imagination, actually, but it's in the Past and Present book, which was the last collection of essays that she put out in 2017 at age 95, is William James, who was not really her cup of tea, normally, I would say, American kind of a philosopher, not quite her period. I don't know that she really ever wrote much about anyone else like James. And I don't honestly remember why exactly she got interested in William James, but she wrote a short essay, which is in the book Past and Present, on William James. She was very struck by James's formulation of the once born and the twice born. And to oversimplify somewhat, the once born are true believers, let's just say. You know, this is your one shot at something, and that's the way it is. The twice born are very struck by the ambiguities, complexities, and sort of counter arguments to their own position. My mother appreciated James's moral realism, she says, a hard-headed realism, but also the fact that he was twice born, and that he himself seemed to be very much this way, a defender of religion in a sense, and of morality, while not being a conventional believer, while holding a philosophic point of view that one would normally say perhaps isn't friendly to moral, simple moral standards and considerations. I think she appreciated and she admired many people who were once born, so to speak, but I think was very attuned to the, especially those thinkers, writers, and predecessors who were twice born. It's a funny term because in America, at least, I don't know if this is true elsewhere, born again, or which in a way you'd think is like twice born, is used for especially for kind of evangelical Protestants who have maybe an adult experience of religion, of faith, and then become again believers, true believers. It's in a way the opposite of twice born, the way James means it. But for my mother, twice born meant an appreciation of, I think, of complexity and the competing pulls on people and the legitimacy of different persuasions or different the attractiveness of different things. James in particular was concerned about religion. My mother was very interested in that too. Matthew Arnold, of course, a great Victorian, famously in his poem Dover Beach talks about, for all that the Victorians were such defenders of religion, they spent half their time, or more than half, worrying about the receding of religious belief and what could replace it, and could a secular version of it really replace it properly? This is a big theme of George Eliot, whom she was a great admirer of too. So again, the complexity and the self-consciousness of the Victorians, I think, very much spoke to her, and is something she wanted to bring out very much. And finally, she's a Victorian, but many Victorian minds, and a defender of morality, but in a complicated, perhaps twice-born way, and also a conservative defender of Victorian morality. That's how she was portrayed. And again, she would not object to that in the context of the politics of the last few decades, certainly in America, elsewhere as well. But I think, like Mill, she would want to say that it was a little more complicated, that Mill wasn't as much of a simple-minded liberal as people thought, and she certainly wasn't a simple conservative. She quotes at the end of her essay on Mill and the Moral Imagination, she quotes Mill on Coleridge, just to complicate things. Mill's, this is a fairly famous statement of Mill's, we may have done something to show that a Tory philosopher cannot be wholly a Tory. Mill writes an appreciation, I believe, of Coleridge, which was regarded at the time as odd, I think, since Coleridge was not a liberal, utilitarian or anything. But we did this to show that a Tory philosopher cannot be wholly a Tory, but must often be a better liberal than liberals themselves. While he is the natural means of rescuing from oblivion truths which Tories have forgotten, and which the prevailing schools of liberalism never knew. That's a wonderful formulation. Truths which Tories have forgotten, but which the prevailing schools of liberalism never knew. So the conservatism, liberalism, I think my mother would have been skeptical of both of those. She thought they were conservative and liberal truths, which were more or less forgotten at different times, perhaps, and had to be brought back to life. She, in her essay on Edmund Burke, which begins this book, she has a very nice story that she was very fond of. She told a lot, I know, and over the years and speeches and stuff, of an Orthodox Jewish young lady in a class she taught at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. This would have been 1970 or something like that, who was very taken with Burke and said she thought Burke's respect for tradition helped explain to her her own attachment to what would have been modern orthodoxy, as we would call it in the Jewish space. So, law-abiding, following Jewish law and practice in a way that's consistent, though, with secular education and understanding. And my mother always was struck that this young lady was so, writes not much about Judaism, and in fact, mildly, depending on how you read him, can be thought by some not to be a great friend of Judaism, though actually a defender in some ways of the Jews. But in any case, Burke was not someone one would normally put in this category. She was very taken that this young lady was herself taken with Burke. And my mother then explains how powerful Burke's reflections on tradition are, his defense of tradition, how important for our times, we're so far from that, the importance of inheritance and so forth. But then I think this is very typical of her work. She then has a footnote, actually. This is a book without many footnotes, The Moral Imagination. And she talks a little bit about the principle of transmission of tradition and also of the updating and improvement of tradition. And she says, had my student been of the Reform denomination of Judaism, she would also have been impressed by such evidence of reformism or even progressivism as Burke's defense of John Wilkes against the parliamentary cabal that expelled him from the House of Commons for libeling the king, his longstanding criticism of the British government and the East India Company for misrule in India, his ardent support of the American colonies in their pursuit of liberty and independence. So even in this essay that does emphasize the importance of Burke's traditionalism, she also points out that he was, in his day, a reformer, a defender of the American Revolution, a Whig. I mean, she doesn't stress this point. The Victorian liberals, to use Joel's formulation, whom she admired very much, loved Burke, but they thought Burke was a liberal. I mean, the great tributes to Burke in the 19th century are written by liberal thinkers, not particularly by Tories. So I think that's also something she very much appreciated and wanted to make possible today. Finally, the last essay in this book is about Lionel Trilling, whom she, as I say, she was very fond of and indebted to. And she talks about Trilling's moral realism. And she says at the very end, this is the last, I chose to close the book with this, so I'll close with this too, that conservatives maybe have a little easier time living in a world of moral realism because they're less utopian and less hopeful about progress, a little more hard-headed. But then she closes by saying the element that is still wanting, however, still wanting for conservatives as well as liberals is the sense of variety, complexity, and difficulty, which comes, Trilling particularly thought, from the experience of literature. It is this that gives a passion and a reality to the moral imagination, which at its best informs the political as well as the literary imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for those wonderful and insightful remarks. And before we turn to some questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask you if you could say something about what it was that led your mother to focus on the Victorians. What is the history of that? How did she, you said she wrote her dissertation on Acton, but do you know what led her to focus on that particular period?
You know, I don't know as much as I should. Like, she wrote about this in a couple of, she didn't write much in the way of memoirs, and but there were a couple of places where she discussed this briefly. So she went to Chicago as a student more of the French Revolution, and I believe she wrote her MA thesis, her master's thesis on Robespierre. And I think she got a certain distaste for the French Revolution quite early in the mid-40s. I mean, again, this became a commonplace later, of course, that the French Revolution was the kind of, the three revolutions, that it was the one that might have laid the groundwork for a certain kind of modern totalitarianism and so forth, certainly on the left. But this was a little earlier, if you think about it. This is during World War II itself, when she writes on Robespierre. And that, I don't quite know what led her exactly to Acton, but by the mid-late 40s, she's in Cambridge looking at the papers of Acton, and which had not been, I think at that point, even published or even well collected. You know, he had this fantastic library, and but he wrote on the French Revolution. So I'm guessing, I've never read, honestly, his lectures on the French Revolution, but you can get them, I think. And I think maybe that was what she found those, my mother found those admirable and sympathetic, and maybe that's what led her to think, gee, Acton would be worth studying.
And what was her initial reaction, do you know, to living in England? So the
They were
first
there,
time
if I'm not mistaken, in 47, 48. It was the main stories I remember hearing about it were it was during, they still had rationing, and it was a very cold winter. This was a famously cold winter, I think, if you read histories of British politics post-war. And people sort of felt like, gee, we won the war, but this is pretty terrible, you know. And that's I mean, the main stories I heard was they were subsiding on a graduate student stipend in Cambridge. So the main story, and it was, England was pretty old back then. I mean, there wasn't central heating or anything like that. So the main stories I remember are stories of sort of being cold and, carefully, purchasing food. I mean, no complaints. I think she loved it. They both loved it. And of course they went back. They liked it so much that when my father was approached to edit Encounter magazine, they went back in 1953 and spent 5 or 6 wonderful years there. So they had no complaints about this, but I mean, I remember the stories of just sort of post-war England as not being what we think of as England today.
Uh-huh. Okay, now Rita, do you want to pose some of the questions that came from the audience?
Yes, we now have 3 questions. I think I will read them. The first one, it's a question by Francisco Carmo Garcia, a student of ours. In what way can we say that Himmelfarb's work in morality could help facing the present social polarization in America? Then we have another question. Sorry. A question from another student of ours, Pedro Mular. Professor Espada spoke about the avoidance of the unfortunate dichotomies. What is the case of today, American political moment? And a third question by a student of another university, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, João Freitas. Can we classify Professor Himmelfarb's work as a combination of Oakeshott's subspecies Praeteritorum with Straussian realism? And that's all. We have this.
Bill, do you want to take on some of the questions about American politics?
Yeah, the last one is too hard for me. So my mother wrote a very nice, one of the first reviews of Strauss. I will say this though, I mean, she respected Oakeshott and taught Oakeshott a lot. I don't know that she wrote, I think she wrote about maybe one essay about Oakeshott. She wrote a review of Strauss's book on tyranny and interpretation of a dialogue of Xenophon's in commentary in, I think, 1949 or 1950, very, very early when Strauss was utterly unknown. I mean, it's so wonderful in those days. I mean, she was no classic scholar, she would have been the first to say, but they had a book by this guy. Some people thought he was interesting. Someone should review it. My mother was around New York intellectual circles. I don't think this would happen today. She reviewed a book that's extremely detailed and really the first time Strauss in America shows how to interpret a classic text.
So they were not in Chicago at the same time at University of Chicago?
No, because so Strauss would have been in New York in the 40s. Now, I think they met maybe, and they had friends who studied with Strauss and so forth. So there was some overlap. She certainly knew of him. But anyway, she writes a wonderful review, which is in actually in Past and Present, of Strauss's book. And she really sees how important Strauss is without herself, while disclaiming any ability to judge the details of the interpretation of Xenophon, that just the whole mode of interpretation, the understanding that the classics were a live option, so to speak, that their thought was alive, would be very, very important. So that's interesting. On America, I would say, I don't want to, yes, polarization. I think she would have had maybe, I'll ascribe to her sort of my views, and but we talked about this a lot the last several years. I mean, 20 years ago, I think one thought maybe all this talk about polarization was overdone, and one should, fight the fights against, especially against the left at that time. I do think by Trump's victory and by the last few years, she did worry a lot about a collapse of American conservatism into a more European style conservatism, and that the left remained very strong and getting more radicalized, perhaps in the universities, and that this was really. And so she was very interested in a new center, a vital center. I did a little project with Bill Galston, who I guess I'm on a panel within a couple of hours, on the new center, which in 2017. And it wasn't, honestly, it was a good project. It wasn't an attempt to do anything intellectually breathtaking or any kind of breakthrough. It was a pulling together material to show that you could imagine centrist public policies in various areas. And I remember at the time talking to her quite a lot about it, and she was more interested than I expected her to be in it, honestly. She, at this point, was not, she didn't like Trump, but she wasn't following politics that closely. She was reading Trollope and so forth, and mystery novels and the newspapers, but she was quite interested because I think she did think that some form of breaking through the polarization was terribly important. I remember having a long discussion with her also. This is something Mark knows a lot about as well, about American exceptionalism. And she reminisced that I think Marty Lipset was one of the key social scientists who brought that idea from Europe to America. And that part of American exceptionalism was we are not, we don't have a communist. I mean, the simple version of it was we don't have a communist party in America and we don't have a fascist party in America, right? And sort of unlike Europe, we're spared these two extremes. And I think she was worried that aspect of American exceptionalism just couldn't be taken for granted, which gets back to the need to really study all these thinkers who thought about these problems.
How do you have anything to add?
I just would like to make a brief reference to my conversations with Bea and Irving about Oakeshott, because I had discovered Oakeshott relatively late, and then I was very curious about Oakeshott. I actually think Gertrude Himmelfarb, I think she wrote, I'm sure she wrote at least one essay, but I think there are actually two essays with a certain period of time in between. And the first one is relatively, I mean, it's friendly, but it's a bit skeptical about Oakeshott's skepticism, but it's a friendly and now the story I'd like to tell, I hope that my memory is not betraying me, but I remember in one of our dinners in Washington talking about Oakeshott and Irving Kristol telling me that when he was editing Encounter in London, Oakeshott submitted the essay on being conservative, and that essay says that the core of the conservative disposition is not the past or this or that, but it's a disposition to enjoy and to enjoy the present. And Irving told me that he didn't like the article, and he said, well, this is not, he didn't publish it in Encounter. But then later, when he went back to America, I think he worked at Basic Books, is this correct? Yeah. And he decided to publish Oakeshott's book, Rationalism in Politics,
right,
at Basic Books, and including the article that he had not published in Encounter. Anyway, so we talked about Oakeshott a lot. They were very friendly, but with some skepticism about some of Oakeshott's skepticism. Anyway, I don't want to take more time to you, and I'm just would like to say that I'm really delighted to have been at this session with you, and I think it's really touching to recall Gertrude Himmelfarb. So
yeah.
I defer.
So I wrap it up then. Yes, I think this was a wonderful session. I really learned some things about Bea that I didn't know before. And thank you all. And I hope our audience has enjoyed and profited from it as well. And he really was an extraordinary person, and her memory deserves cultivating. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. See you.
Thank you.